Okay, this is going to be a little shorter than usual episode because, as I'm sure you can tell, I am a bit under the weather.
Hey, poor! Hey, poor! Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is busy bugging the crap out of me for attention. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. This is a news show episode where I cover stories in the news that are related to things like atheism, secularism, science, or I find just plain interesting. Next episode will be a couple of chapters from the Apocrypha. And yes, Goldbeard will be joining me for those. I've already got them in the can, as it were. It has been a busy week for me. Come here. As I said in the last episode, we have been getting ready for an inspection at work, so I wasn't able to get the new cat to the vet until Thursday morning. And much to my surprise, as well as to the vet's, she turned out to be a he. I was worried that he wouldn't make it to the vet because he'd largely stopped eating a day or so beforehand, which is never a good sign. One thing that gave me a bit of hope was when I was taking him to the vet, he saw me bring out the cat carrier and wasn't happy. After putting him in the cat carrier, despite being weak, he repeatedly bashed his head against the door, trying to force it open. Even when I tilted the carrier upwards to shift him away from the door, he continued to do this. That told me he was a fighter. I got him to the vet, they looked him over, couldn't find a chip, discovered that she was a he, and said that they thought that the cat might have kidney problems, and if he did, it wasn't a good sign. The only way to know for sure was to do some blood tests. I agreed, not only because the cat was a fighter, but because if there was a chance to save him, I wanted him to have it, rather than just putting him down because it was cheaper and easier. They ran the blood work, and the vet, an overweight man in his early 60s, came bouncing into the room like he was a teenager with the results. The blood work indicated that the cat's kidney function was normal, and that he most likely had some kind of infection. The vet believed that some IV fluids and a round of antibiotics would fix him up. Naturally, I agreed. It wasn't cheap, about $300 and all, but after losing Buttons and the kitten, I was happy to pay the money to give at least one cat a shot at life. Despite being sick, the cat was such a charmer with his appearance and personality that everyone in the vet's office gushed over how pretty and sweet he was. I probably could have gotten one of them to take him off my hands if I wanted, but he'd already wormed his way into my heart at that point, and it would have been hard to let him go. On the way home from the vet's, a gaggle of kids in the trailer park came running up to look at him. He very sweetly rubbed up against the fingers they poked through the door and purred loudly at the attention. They asked me if I had a name for him yet, and I said no. One of them shouted, "Billy Bob!" Another one shouted, "Bubba!" I thought for a moment. He's a fierce fighter despite being declawed, but is also very cute and cuddly. Now, who springs to mind when you think of someone like that? Well, if you're a fan of bad movies, there's really only one name that fits.
All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up. See this? This is my boomstick!
I looked at the kids and said, I think maybe Ash is what I'll call him. All of them cooed in agreement, so that's his name. I am happy to report that the antibiotics seem to be working and Ash is eating again. He's still a little more than bones and fur, and I won't relax until he's at a healthy weight. I'm also not going to try and introduce him to Fuzznuts until he's healthy. Not only because I don't want to risk him infecting Fuzznuts, but because Ash is declawed, and if the two of them get into a squabble before I can separate them, he can't really defend himself. I don't know if it's because he was declawed, or if his previous owners abused him, but I have noticed that Ash doesn't like walking on carpet. He tends to avoid it at all costs if he can help it. Still, he's a sweet, loving cat who likes nothing better than cuddling up next to me when I'm in bed. The vet thinks that he's about a year or so older than Fuzznuts, so about 8 or 9 years old. I'll have a few pics of him in the show notes for this week's episode. My other big news, and this will be the largest political segment of the episode, so those of you who aren't too fond of politics won't have to suffer through a lot this week, is that Saturday night was the largest fundraiser of the year for the County Democratic Party. I went. It was only $50, which is a third of what it costs to go to the state party's event. Despite this being a very red county, we had a record-setting turnout of over 200 people. Almost every Democratic candidate for local, state, and federal office showed up. We had one local candidate who didn't show, and Phil Bredesen, who is running for Bob Corker's old seat in the Senate, couldn't make it. Bredesen did, however, send someone to speak on his behalf. Mary Mancini, chair of the Tennessee Democratic Party, was also there. And yes, I did talk to her about Hoffer's book, The True Believer. She seemed interested by it, so we'll have to see if she reads it and takes it to heart. I also gave a copy of the book to one candidate, Hannah Ali, whom I've mentioned before on the podcast. My goal is to try and get a copy of the book into the hands of every Democrat running for office that I can. I didn't know if I was going to be able to attend the event until almost the last minute, so I didn't order any more after the last batch I ordered, and only had one copy to give. I picked Hannah because, out of all the candidates, she has the hardest campaign of all. She's a woman of color, an immigrant, and a Muslim. She seemed appreciative of the gift, and I hope that she reads it and uses it to help her win. She is, in many ways, after all, the embodiment of the American dream. She came to America at a young age and has managed to become an accomplished member of the medical profession despite her humble beginnings. Still, just the fact that someone like her is willing to take an expensive gamble against the odds fills me with hope that we can change things. I also have to say a few things about the place where the event was held. The owners of it are Democrats, and they donated the use of it to the party for the event. And it really was a lavish place, even though it doesn't seem like it when you first pull up. It's located on a cattle farm about 20 minutes away from where I live. It has a couple of barns, a caretaker's house, and the main house. The caretaker's house looks like it was built in the late 19th century, early 20th century, though I never saw the inside of it, so I don't know for certain. The main house looks like it was built in the 40s or 50s and is decorated in a style that makes you think John Wayne or Frank Sinatra would have been happy to call it home in that era. It was filled with antiques, taxidermied animals, and art from all over. One of the antiques caught my eye. It was a lamp made from an old fire extinguisher. Far more years ago than I care to think about, my father, a Republican, bought an old fire extinguisher and turned it into a lamp. Some years ago, he sold it at a yard sale. I looked at that lamp and thought, nah, couldn't be, could it? I texted a picture of the lamp to my brother and asked him if he thought it was the same lamp. He said that it looked like the same lamp to him. I'm sure my father, being a Republican, would be horrified at his lamp being owned by Democrats and that they had installed it at a place where the party was holding a fundraiser. I'll post a bunch of pictures I took of the event in the show notes. The view out of the windows from the place were just amazing. From looking out the windows, you'd have no idea that the area is as densely populated as it is. You'd think that you were out in the middle of nowhere. You're not. It's not in the middle of town, but even ignoring the caretaker's house, you don't have to go all that far to find a neighbor. They rent out the place for weddings and as a place to stay when one is on vacation. On a personal note, I found the place to be a rather shocking reminder of the kind of privileged background I came from. While I didn't grow up in a house as nice and as large as that, most of my parents' friends did live in places like that. Growing up, I thought that was just how everybody lived. So, even though I've been living in a beer can for almost 20 years now, it was a bit of a shock to find myself in a place similar to ones I spent a lot of time in growing up, and knowing that it rents for hundreds of dollars a day. Anything else? Well, as I said earlier, there is a bit of good news for those of you out there who happen to enjoy the Ethiopian Apocrypha. Skullbeard and I have managed to get a bunch of material in the can, so it's unlikely that you'll have to put up with just me reading it again anytime soon. We have finished the first book, and I think what I'm going to do with the second book is violate my rule about not reading ahead and actually try and translate it a bit into standard English. There was a whole lot of unintelligible gibberish in the last parts that we read, and it was impossible for us to figure out some of the names which would have given us an idea of what the fuck the book was talking about. I also want to say that for fans of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, someone has done a hysterical Trump and Putin meme based on the movie that I'll have posted in the show notes. A final note, Patreon supporter George has increased his support to $5 an episode, which I really want to thank him for. Since I don't have any paid sick time yet, and I've had to take off 2 days of work because of being sick, and I've had a bunch of extra expenses this month, I really appreciate the additional support. I definitely do need it. Okay, let's get to the news.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Asps. Very dangerous. You go first.
From mentalfloss.com, teen archaeologist finds a tooth that's more than 500,000 years old. A tooth belonging to an early human subspecies was unearthed recently in France, but the tooth fairy is about 560,000 years too late. Phys.org reports that the rare discovery was made by a 16-year-old volunteer archaeologist during a dig inside a cave near Toitavel? I don't know. I don't speak French. A French commune in the Pyrenees near the Spanish border. Scientists say the tooth, a worn lower incisor, likely belonged to a member of the Homo heidelbergensis species, which lived about 700,000 to 200,000 years ago. Now, I know some people will be gawking over the fact that the kid who found the thing was only 16. But what I want to focus on is that even in an age where stories about multi-billion-dollar science experiments like those conducted at the LHC abound, there's still the possibility for ordinary individuals to advance scientific knowledge without vast sums of money being involved. We need more things like this, not merely because you never know what someone will turn up at a dig site, but because it teaches ordinary people about science and the scientific method. Even if this kid never grows up to be a scientist, she has a better understanding of science than what one can get from a textbook. Religious types are more than happy to take anyone who asks on a mission trip, but how many scientists are willing to allow the average person to poke around in their lab or research site? Every week there are hundreds of thousands of religious leaders, just in the U.S., who get in front of people and talk to them about God. How different would our society be if in every town in America there was one place anyone could go on a Sunday and learn, if not participate, in scientific projects? Really, now that I think about it, why don't we have such places dedicated to things like science and art? Museums, of course, offer some of this, but few offer a hands-on experience. And even fewer provide opportunities for people to get their hands dirty doing real research. If only I had crazy billionaire money.
Maybe it's a little early. Maybe the time is not quite yet. But
But those other worlds, promising untold opportunities, beckon. Silently, they orbit the sun, waiting.
From MarsTechnica.com. Virgin's Unity spaceship sets a new altitude record of 52 kilometers. Virgin Galactic has been saying for some time that it will reach outer space this year, and on Thursday it came the closest it has ever gotten. During the third powered flight of the VSS Unity vehicle, the spacecraft reached an altitude of 52 kilometers, 32.3 miles, just over halfway toward the Kármán line, which is generally regarded as the beginning of space. This is the first time that Virgin Galactic has flown into the mesosphere. The company also released a few other details about the flight, noting that the spacecraft was released from its carrier aircraft at 14.2 kilometers, that its engine burned for 42 seconds, and that the vehicle reached a maximum speed of Mach 2.7. Pilots Dave McKay and Mike Masucci flew the Unity vehicle on Wednesday morning from the Mojave Air and Spaceport. It was a thrill from start to finish, McKay said after the flight in a company news release. Unity's rocket motor performed magnificently again, and Such pulled off a smooth landing. This was a new altitude record for both of us in the cockpit, not to mention our mannequin in the back, and the views of the Earth from the black sky were magnificent. 15 years ago, my money would have been on Virgin Galactic being the first successful private space company. Clearly, SpaceX has taken the lead, though part of the reason, at least why, Virgin Galactic has fallen behind has to do with the fatal accidents which they've had. And while suborbital flight doesn't seem to be nearly as sexy as it once did in an era when SpaceX is firing off a rocket almost every week, there is much to be gained from it, assuming they can actually manage to make their flights routine. The costs of going suborbital are lower than those associated with those of going to the ISS, or anywhere in orbit for that matter. And while there have been civilian astronauts who've bought tickets to the ISS, all the ones who've gone to date have been tech billionaires. Imagine if we sent poets, artists, and the like into space. All the astronauts who've gone to space have said that the experience has changed them on an emotional level, but they haven't really been able to explain how this has happened to them. Not terribly surprising, since it's not something they're trained to do. Artists, on the other hand, are trained to convey emotion. Take someone like J.J. Abrams, Christopher Nolan, or artist Michael Whelan, who has done a lot of science fiction and fantasy book covers, and put them in a Virgin Galactic flight. Given the amazing shit that they've already done without ever leaving the planet, I cannot imagine what they will do if they're only given a brief glimpse of what it's like to be in space. It certainly would be worth the small amount that such a flight would cost when compared to the tens of millions of dollars it costs to send someone to the ISS.
That was the most offensive science report I've ever heard. How could you do such a thing?
Beavis helped me.
From LiveScience.com. Worms frozen for 42,000 years in Siberian permafrost wriggled to life. Did you ever wake up from a long nap feeling a little disoriented, not quite knowing where you were? Now imagine getting a wake-up call after being asleep for 42,000 years. In Siberia, melting permafrost is releasing nematodes. Microscopic worms that live in soil that have been suspended in deep freeze since the Pleistocene. Despite being frozen for tens of thousands of years, 2 species of these worms were successfully revived, scientists recently reported in a new study. Now, I know that the paranoid out there will start talking about how this could lead to things like ancient diseases we've long since lost immunity to, cropping up and wiping out humanity. I find stories like this fascinating since they offer opportunities for us to save lives. Imagine a fairly common scenario. Someone is having a massive heart attack. Conventional methods like CPR or whatever, are ineffective at reviving the person. Rather than simply declaring the person dead, they're able to freeze them until they can get the person to the hospital, do a detailed analysis of the problem, figure out a solution, and correct it. Large numbers of people on waiting lists for organ transplants die before an organ becomes available. Imagine if they could be frozen until a new organ can be found or grown via cloning or 3D printed, which would be the ideal situation, since the patient wouldn't have to take anti-rejection drugs for the rest of their life. It's something like, being able to understand how these worms could survive freezing would help us in such a situation. Do they produce a chemical that prevents their cells from rupturing when they freeze? If they do, what's the chemical? Is it toxic to humans? We need to know this stuff. And, even if you could never, dose somebody and freeze them and have them survive, it could be a way to preserve organs, for transplant operations. So if somebody wants to donate their organs when they die, but there's no suitable donor needing one, that's occasionally happens, rather than just saying, well, we can't do anything with them, we could freeze them and then thaw them out and then transplant them into somebody when they were, somebody with that, say, rare blood type needed them. From ScienceAlert.com. For the first time, scientists witness a single hurricane season change the anatomy of a species. Caribbean lizards that survived the tough 2017 hurricane season have longer toe pads on both front and back limbs, report researchers. The work is the first to demonstrate the effects of hurricane-induced natural selection. The hyperactive 2017 season was one of the worst that the Atlantic region has ever experienced. Hurricane Harvey hit in mid-August 2017, followed just a few weeks later by Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria in September. Each of the storms had winds in excess of 125 miles an hour. That's 201 kilometers an hour for those of you in the civilized parts of the world. With Irma up to 170 miles per hour, that's 113 kilometers per hour. Some tropical anole lizards living on the more remote cays of Turks and Caicos survived, and some didn't. Those that survived all had the larger footpads. Not that this will change the minds of the likes of Ken Ham, but this is yet more proof of evolution. It also gives hints as to the kinds of changes we can see in animals as climate warms. And it's probably not something that scientists would have expected beforehand. Pun not intended. It also makes you wonder what environmental changes drove our evolution. I can remember reading years ago a piece in Scientific American which posed the idea that the reasons humans have such large brains has to do with climate change. The hypothesis went something like this. Way back when our ancestors were still hanging out in the trees and the climate became drier, we moved out of the trees to look for food. Those of our ancestors who were able to stand upright for longer periods of time had two advantages over those who couldn't. The first was that they could spot food at a distance. The second was that they could spot predators at a distance. Another consequence of this was that since the upright individuals presented less surface area to the direct sun, those of us who had the least amount of hair on our bodies had more energy for moving around and growing our brains, since the food we ate wasn't being converted to hair. Larger brains meant that we were better able to secure food and have more kids, thus leading to our dominance. Were there other things that happened in the environment which contributed to this? I've often wondered if the larger brow ridges on Neanderthals meant that they sweat more than we do, thus making it easier for predators, be they big cats or Homo sapiens sapiens, to find and kill them. I don't know. And unless somebody decides to clone a Neanderthal, probably never know.
Viridian Dynamics. Lying. It's always wrong. But sometimes companies have to say things that aren't 100% true. Is that wrong? No. When companies aren't truthful, it's not because we're bad. It's because we understand things that you don't. Viridian Dynamics. People lie. Companies protect their interests. It's different.
From WashingtonPost.com. The junk debt that tanked the economy, it's back in a big way. Like most people, you probably assume that the level of lending done by banks at any moment is largely driven by how much demand there is from borrowers. But in the world of modern finance, that's only part of the story. For just as important is the level of demand from investors. Pension funds, hedge funds, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies to buy the loans that banks make. Indeed, there are times when there's so much demand for loans from investors and the profit from selling them is so lucrative that bankers are only too happy to go out and make bigger and riskier loans than they would if they were keeping them on their own books. That was the situation back in 2006 when investors were so keen to own mortgage-backed securities that Wall Street was begging lenders for more and more product. You know how that turned out. Now it is happening again, as investors and money managers scramble to buy floating rate debt. Debt offering interest payments that will increase as global interest rates rise, as they are expected to over the next few years. A big new source of floating rate credit is the market for leveraged loans. Loans to highly indebted businesses that are packaged into securities known as collateralized loan obligations, or CLOs. Because the market seems to have an insatiable appetite for CLOs, leveraged lending and CLO issuance through the first half of the year are already up 38% over last year's near record levels. Credit rating companies such as Standard & Poor's and Moody's have recently warned that this surge in corporate borrowing and lending has led to a noticeable decline in the quality of the loans. The borrowers have lower credit ratings. The loans contain fewer of the standard conditions that are meant to protect lenders, and the rating companies calculate that lenders should expect to recover less of their money if the borrowers default or go into bankruptcy. If you'll remember, the credit ratings companies were all too happy to endorse the shitty companies and mortgage-backed securities right up until the economy imploded back in 2008. If they're now saying that this is some bad shit, how fucking awful must it be? I'm thinking that we're probably really boned. Especially when you consider that there's other kind of junk debt out there, like subprime auto loans and, student loans that Betsy DeVos is now saying, yeah, you got ripped off, but you're still going to have to pay for them. I have a friend who recently bought a house thanks to really what I'd have to call questionable loan practices. And by that I mean they basically allowed her to get what was known back in the early 2000s as an interest-only loan. She had enough money to come up with, cover the cost of things like processing the paperwork and doing the house inspection, but not really a meaningful deposit or down payment. The fucking, the banks were all too happy to lend her money. And I know her, and I know that she will do everything she can to pay that shit off and make her payments. But, if the economy goes in the crapper, she may have a problem doing that. And the economy is almost certainly going to go in the crapper. One thing that I have not seen reported at all is the in recent years, the pecan farmers in Georgia have just seen demand for pecans skyrocket. The Chinese have fallen in love with pecans, which apparently they never got until recently. So anything the Georgia farmers can grow, they can sell. Well, That is, until our president decided to get into a trade war with China. China has slapped tariffs on pecans because the Chinese, like the Europeans, are targeting areas which voted heavily for Trump with their retaliatory tariffs. This has caused the price of pecans to fall. Now, when the demand started skyrocketing for pecans, a lot of those farmers went into debt to buy more land, to plant more trees, to buy more equipment, to harvest more nuts. Because, hey, there's money to be made, and if you don't have the land and the equipment, you can't get any of that. What are they going to do? Now, I know Trump has given the soybean farmers, or is pledging to give the soybean farmers, I don't think any of them have actually gotten a check yet, a bunch of money to help them since his trade war with China has hurt them. Which is socialism, but you'll never see any of them turning that money down. And the assumption is that, well, once the tariffs are dropped, because we've come to some kind of agreement, demand will go back. The problem with that is the Chinese aren't allowing the demand to be unmet. They're going to other countries and buying up their soybean crops. Because the U.S. isn't the only place in the world where you can go grow soybeans. Shocking, isn't it? They're buying up the crops in like Latin America. Well, what do you think's going to happen there? Those guys are going to expand their operations, to meet the demand. Well, and what happens when the sanctions are, the tariffs are lifted, if they ever are? Are the Chinese immediately going to go back to buying American ones? I don't know. I mean, if Brazilian soybeans are cheaper than American soybeans, why would the Chinese buy American soybeans? And even if, they're the same price, or maybe Brazilian soybeans are a little more expensive, the Chinese might figure that they have more influence and have less risk if they keep buying Brazilian soybeans than if they buy American soybeans. So, we don't know what's going to happen with this, but there's a good chance it won't be pretty. So, I suggest all of you out there, brace yourselves. Okay, as you can tell, I am really starting to sound bad. I am tired, and this is, if I was at work, this would be the beginning of my work day, more or less. I mean, it'd be my first break, and I'm tired, so I'm gonna end this here. Put out a longer episode next week, and Patreon supporters, you will be getting a bonus episode. Well, it would be today since it's after midnight, but you'll be getting it before the 1st of August. Because I've already got it in the can. It's just some quick editing and a few other little things.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzz-Nuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.